Today we'll be covering some of the basics of character animation in Blender by playing with this free Baby Yoda rig. It's going to be an overview of how I approach a new character rig and starting a character animation. In future videos, we'll do follow-along videos such as walk cycles, bouncing balls, and jumps, but this video is geared towards learning how to approach character animations as an overview. You can download the rig for free made by Pixelurge, and the link's in the description below. I can't give away this project on Patreon because I don't own Star Wars. If I did, I probably wouldn't be begging you for money on Patreon. So first, open the blend file and admire how cute Baby Yoda is. Then familiarize yourself with the rig. Anytime you start working with a new rig, you're going to have to learn how to use the controls. It's kind of like a video game controller. A lot of the buttons do the same things you're used to, but they're going to be in different positions. So to enter pose mode, you're going to select the controls, hold tab, and scroll down to pose mode. Now, once all these are colored, you know that means you can start controlling Baby Yoda. You won't be able to select or edit your mesh in pose mode. You can only select the controls and the bones that are visible. So first, let's hide his robe so that we can see what these controls are exactly doing to his body. So now you have a little naked Baby Yoda. So we're going to go back into pose mode. And what we can do is we can just grab any one of these controls. So let's grab this little ring right here. And I'm just going to start moving it around with the G key. And really, you're just going through and you're kind of testing all of the controls and what they do. You'll notice that some controls, when you go to grab, they may not want to move and you may have to use rotate. They may have it locked to only rotate, or they may have it locked to only grab. Now, I encourage you to go through and play with it yourself and kind of figure it out for yourself and what works for you, but I'm going to go through some of the basics of this rig. So we have this circle up here, and grabbing that, we can kind of move around the head. We come down here, we have these boxes around the feet, and if we grab those, you can see that his leg bends, and it's on an IK system there, meaning that it'll automatically bend for you. Back here are the pole targets, the pole targets are up here, so if you grab it here and you bend, you can move his knee around in the position of that. Now, when you select a controller, if you want to reset it to its original position, you can hold Alt and then R, G, and S. So rotation, grab, and scale. So if I do that, it will reset it to where it's at. Now this down here is considered the root. So this is what moves the whole rig. Everything is parented to that. But here you have kind of your star control, and most character rigs will have this. And this will also move your character without moving your root. So that way you can do things like jumps and stuff like that and keep your root in order. So it's a lot easier to animate when you have complex animations if you have those two separate from one another. Now, if we come up here, you can see that we can make him do a little hip dance there. And again, this is kind of in the center, meant to kind of play with the torso there. With the hands, they don't have an IK system. It's 4K, meaning that you need to grab each one and move it yourself individually to get the arms in the correct position that you want. Around the hands here, we have all these little circles. And if we grab those and rotate those, we can see that we have the fingers. Now, a lot of character rigs will actually have these locked to rotation. Here, they just have everything set to grab. Now, let's come up here to the face. All these little points around the face, it looks like a lot and it looks confusing, but just think of each point as kind of controlling that part of the face. So if we grab this little circle and drag up, you can see that we're kind of dragging that part of the eyelid. And if we grab up here, you can see that we're animating the eyebrows. Now out here, we have this here, and inside of here, we have these little circles. So these little circles will move each individual eyeball. You can see that he's looking around there. And if we click here, we can see that we're going to move both eyes. So most of the time, you're going to animate your eyes with this unless you're trying to do something kind of funny with a cartoon. Here we have this little arrow, and if we rotate that arrow, it's actually going to rotate his shoulder and help out with kind of deformation there, so we can rotate his clavicle and things like that to help with deformation around the shoulder. So the reason I'm choosing these controls to kind of go over is because these are kind of the basic controls that will come with most character rigs. Now, these controller icons may look different, or you may even be looking at the bones themselves, but in general, most complex character rigs or professional character rigs are going to have a lot of these controls built into them. So let's come in here. We also have the mouth controls. So we have this one here, which allows us to just open the entire mouth. Then we have all these, which allows us to kind of micromanage that mouth and work there. Now you'll notice that we have these circles here, and these kind of they're in between bones. So here you can see that this operates on the wrist, this operates on the elbow, and then we have these in betweens. Now these can be used for kind of corrective deformation, or if you want to do some extreme poses. So what I mean by corrective deformation is that if we bent it and we bent his hand and it just didn't look right, we could kind of come in here and modify this for extreme poses. So let's jump into my scene. I've already set up some lighting in the camera. I've chosen to set my camera close up to the face so that I can focus on a simpler animation for the sake of time in this tutorial. So let's talk about kind of the setup I'll do for character animation. Generally, I'll drag up here and I will put a timeline, which most of the time this will be there by default. And then I'm going to drag this window over here, drag this window up here. Now I'm going to leave this one here, and I'm going to leave this as my camera view so that I can see what's in the camera, because there's no point in animating the entire character's body when only a small portion is visible to the camera. Then down here, I'm going to turn this into the dope sheet. Now, when I approach a character animation, I usually want to start with the keyframe poses. Keyframe poses are the most important poses in your animation for timing. So for example, the goober popping up in my dancing animation is a key pose. Now once we have our key poses, Blender will automatically interpolate the data between the poses, creating in-between keyframes. An in-between keyframe is just a frame between key poses. Now although Blender does a good job of filling in data, we will have to go in and add more in between the frames to get the timing and animation that we want. After that, we will use the graph editor to tweak the easing of our keyframe. So before we get started with doing the key poses, we know that we're probably only going to be doing rotation and positioning. We're not likely to scale up any of these bones. So what we can actually do is we can come back down here to the keying set, and we can go to active keying set here. We can click that, and we get a preset list. Now you can make your own, but you're going to be able to use mostly here, and you should never have to leave these. So we're going to click Loc Rotate, and what that means is location and rotation. What that means is that whenever we make a keyframe, if we have automatic keyframing on, or when we insert, it's only going to insert a location and rotation keyframe. That way, when we're over here and we're trying to manage all of our keyframes, we don't have a bunch of scales in there kind of messing it up and cluttering the view. So I'm just going to click this little auto key set here, and I'm just going to begin placing my keyframes. You do not need to do the same exact animations as me. Just follow the same principles and make your own animation. It's important to start big and go small. So we'll start with the full head, then we'll move down to the smaller facial features. And notice that as the eye blinks, I'm adjusting the surrounding facial features to compensate for the movement. This entire face moves when you move one part. Animating all these different pieces will add some life to the character. Secondary action is any action after the main action. So for example, as Yoda turns his head, I will want his ears to lag behind a little bit. We can offset this later in the dope sheet to further make it a secondary action. It's at this point, especially, that you're really going to want something like reference footage. So for example, if you're animating Baby Yoda, you can go to maybe Giphy and pull up a looping image of Baby Yoda doing something cute that you want to mimic. Okay, so I've kind of blocked out the basic animation, and if we play it back here, we can see that it looks kind of awful. And that's because right now it's just interpreting from frame to frame with basic linear interpolation, meaning that it's just getting from point A to B the quickest way it knows. So later, we'll actually go through and we'll adjust the easing and make these moments feel a lot more natural. But for now, we're working on the blocking and the timing. So when I'm approaching a character animation, what I like to do is I like to go into the dope sheet. And you may have seen me working in this before. I assume that if you're watching this tutorial, you know how to use it. But up here, you can grab your entire keyframe stack. And then down here, you have everything labeled so that you can grab the keyframes individually. So what we can do is we can select everything in there by pressing A. We can press T. This takes our interpolation menu up, and we're going to hit constant. And if we go over to the graph editor, you can see exactly what that's doing. Just zoom in there. You can see that there is no interpolation, that it goes from one keyframe and then it just jumps to the next. So let's go back to our dope sheet. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to set everything to constant, and then we're going to play this animation back. And we can see kind of our keyframes and our main poses here. Now what we can do is we can go through and adjust the timing. So let's say, for example, that I feel like he should rest a tiny bit longer after he perks up here. before turning. So what I'm going to do is I know that's the head control, which will show my keyframes down here. So before this keyframe goes, I'm actually going to take this keyframe and move it up a bit. So now kind of play with your animation in this mode until you get the timing done. Now I did some of this during my time lapse to kind of speed up the process, and I'm pretty happy with this timing. And now that we have our blocking of our keyframes done, we will now move into animating the in-between frames. So what we'll do is we'll go through these main keyframes and we'll add extra frames. So this is a simple animation, so it shouldn't take much, but I'll add a few frames in between here to make some of the movements feel more natural. So a great way to make your movements feel natural is that everything in nature moves on an arc. So what I'm trying to do here is add an arc to some of the motions, raising part of an eyebrow as it rotates, for example, to make it arc across the motion. And these little features help add realism. Another great example is if you look at his head kind of rotating. If you notice, he kind of lifts his head to rotate back over to the left, which is something people do. And I'm just going to exaggerate that a bit more. So just go through, add the frames that you think look best. So let's move on to easing. So the dope sheet over here is great for grabbing keyframes, moving around, timing them, selecting them, copying them. But when it comes to easing and kind of micromanaging our keyframes, we're going to want to go to the graph editor. So we can access that up here. Okay, so now that we can see the easing, let's turn it on to the default Bezier here. And this provides us with a little bit of easing, but it's still going to feel kind of sluggish. So let's play our animation back. And you can see that it feels a little bit better than the linear. So if I go to linear here, which is trying to get to A to B as fast as possible, you can see it looks very robotic and doesn't have much character. And that's because in real world, we don't move like robots. We move like an organic being. And what that means is that when we make a motion, we have to kind of wind up for that motion. And when we come out of that motion, we have to slow down. A great example is a pitcher. When a pitcher pitches a ball, they wind up slowly, snap the ball forward, and then their hand kind of slowly falls back down to the waist. So that's essentially what we're doing with easing. So for example, where you can see it's particularly troublesome here is pay attention to his head movement. His head movement feels very kind of unnatural and floaty. So what we're going to do is we're going to select everything on our rig. We're going to come over here and we're going to apply Bezier to everything. And you can see that looks a tiny bit better, but it could still use a lot of work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through easing the head turn. And then after that, I'm going to time lapse through the rest of the easing, and you can kind of just watch and I'll speak over that. So one thing to note is that when you select a control, you can come up here and you can press this button, only selected. So if I turn that off, you can see that I can see all of the keyframes for Baby Yoda. And if we get in here, you can see that there's a bunch of just little tiny motions and things like that. And it's just a lot to deal with. So you can see there's no way you're going to be able to get in here and click through all of these and adjust all these keyframes. So what we can do is we can turn on this only selected button, and then it will reduce it to the keyframes on the object that we have selected. So that's what we're going to do as we move through to kind of adjust the easing on everything here. Now, the other thing I like to do is if you select all and then you tap period, then Blender will zoom in for you. Now, I'm actually going to take this and drag this up over the camera view. So we can see here that we have all of our animation on these 3 rotation keyframes. So what I'm actually going to do, because we only used rotation keyframes on this, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to delete these by pressing X, and then I will delete the location keyframes as well. So now we have just the rotation keyframes for the head. Now you're going to have to kind of go through and do this for each control that you do. It's a tedious process, but it's also what takes your animation that extra 10% and gives it that polished look. You'll spend a lot of your animating time usually in here adjusting these eases and things like that and tweaking your animation until you get something right. So we're going to focus here on his head movement. So it can be hard, but you just need to focus on just the general head movement. So that's all we're going at. So let's say that we want him to come into this ease a little bit more. So I can select both handles by clicking that center one. I can rotate those, grab those, scale those, or whatever. And I can grab here and select each handle and adjust those. Now, and this is my Z rotation. Now, Blender Z is up, but in this free rig, they have Y up, which is standard. This is a keyframe that it looks like I don't need it. If I delete it, that curve's going to stay the same. Looks like this one will stay the same. So I can kind of go through, clean up some of these keyframes here that are just kind of cluttering my space. And looks like this keyframe could maybe be lost. Okay, cool. So already kind of cleaning up may help a little bit. You can see that it already feels a little bit more natural. Now what we're going to do is go through and adjust the easing. So we know that we want to take this Y here. We're going to drag that out and give that a little bit smoother of a landing. Give that a little bit smoother of a landing. And this one can probably be gone. Let's go through. We're going to make them take a little bit while come out of that turn. We probably don't need that one or that one. Here, let's hit scale that on the X, and that's going to give us a little bit of a pause there. So a lot of times I've noticed that beginner animators, they want to just add motion to everything. They don't want to let their character rest. So one way of resting is we can actually duplicate this keyframe and just give it a small pause there. Or what you can do is what I just did and scale it up, and it'll kind of come here and slow down before going back out. And that kind of helps give it a rest. So let's just go through and scale those. I'm selecting both so that they kind of maintain that same curve. Looks like here's a little bit unnecessary. So let's go through, scale that. We'll leave that one there. Okay, so you don't have to do these. It's just kind of, I know that I wanted him to kind of ease in and out of things slowly. You know, you can tweak each of these individually. I'm just kind of doing a quick pass over. So let's see what this looks like. There we go. So we can kind of see that he's got more of a snappy motion. Now, I actually think that here, he's kind of snapping out of that a little quickly. Baby Yoda's a baby, so he does kind of have like a little ragdoll head. So he doesn't snap around too quickly. So let's bring that easing back in. And I'm actually just going to take those keyframes and bring those over. Take this here. Bring that back a bit. Now, another thing too is this is the value that correlates. So if I grab this and bring it up, this will actually give me a little bit of overshoot so that he'll land on his position, go a little bit above, and then come back in. And this kind of gives you more natural motion. That's called follow through because you never stop dead in your tracks. So adding a little bit of follow through can also help add some realism. So there we go. That's feeling a lot more natural. I think here I want more of a pause. Now he's really snapping his head here. So let's get rid of that because, like I said, Baby Yoda is a baby. And we can see here that the contender is this right here. And you can see here in the easing. Let's zoom in on that. This is a good example of what we don't want. We can see that it's coming here and then it's just a sharp drop off. And this should help it feel a little bit more natural. Again, we have a huge scale there, so it's kind of snapping the easing up there. So when I scaled it earlier, you can see that it made it so that that was a quick snap. So this is an instance where I'm actually going to duplicate it, hold X and kind of move that there and just add a little bit of rest there. And I can see that I have a rest there on that keyframe. So we're just going to kind of match that. And there we go. So this should give us a lot more natural head motions. It kind of looks that way quickly. And there we go. So now we have a more natural looking head motion. And then I'm just going to time lapse through and you can kind of follow along as I adjust the easing on the rest of my keyframe. So after tweaking my easing, I was ready to render it out. So I rendered this out with a glare, denoising, lens distortion, color grading the compositor. I found some lens flare footage online that was free to use and some stock footage to give it a little bit of a glare. Again, this was just a basic overview of how to approach a character animation. Try your own animation and post it in the comments below or tag me on your Instagram. In future videos, I will go through more specific details for beginners and kind of an A to B process of how to animate certain things with a character. But again, I wanted to give you guys an overview of how I like to tackle a new character rig and approaching a character animation. Thanks for watching. Please comment and subscribe. For my patrons this month, there is a lighting setup since I couldn't give away this Star Wars file. And also, you will be getting this texture. And stay tuned because I'll be giving away a free texture this month to everybody as well.